Good morning, dear students of class 12. Welcome to the English online learning class. Today we are going to further continue with the lesson The Open Window by H. Monroe Saki, part 6. Now first a quick recap of what we did in the previous classes. Now Frampton Nuttall has been advised by his doctor to visit Willetside, so that he can take rest and he can calm down his troubled nerves as he is suffering from nervous breakdown. Now his sister is very much concerned about him. She had stayed in this village 4 years ago, so she knows some people there, and she gives her brother letters of introduction so that he would get adjusted well in the village. The first house that he visits when he comes to the village for his rural retreat is the house of Mrs. Sappleton. At the time, Mrs. Sappleton is doing some work upstairs. So his 15 years old niece, Vera, she tries to have a conversation with Frampton Nuttall. And during this conversation, she learns that Mr. Frampton Nuttall is new in this village and he doesn't know anyone. His sister had lived in this village 4 years ago, and he only knows about Mrs. Sappleton, her name and address. So Vera says, probably you do not know about the tragedy that happened with Mrs. Sappleton. It so happened, she says, that you would be wondering why the French window is open on an October afternoon. Frampton agreed to it. Then she began that 3 years ago, through this window, her aunt's husband and 2 brothers, they left for hunting in the marshes, and they were caught in the bog. They never returned, and even their bodies were not recovered. Aunt has a feeling that probably they are going to return back, and they had left the aunt's husband and her 2 brothers along with a little brown spaniel. Now the girl says that she has a creepy feeling, scary feeling, that probably they would be returning. Now when Aunt joins Frampton Nuttall, she tries to find out from Frampton that Vera must be entertaining you, and Frampton Nuttall agrees to it. Then Mrs. Sappleton, she also mentions the open window, and she says that she is waiting for her husband and 2 brothers to return. Frampton Nuttall gives a sympathetic look and he looks towards Vera. But then we find that Mrs. Sappleton is very much excited and Vera is also seeing in the same direction. Mrs. Sappleton announces that her husband and 2 brothers are returning back and they would be entering through the drawing room through the open window. And Frampton also sees in that direction, and he is horrified to see the 3 figures approaching. Now here we stopped in the previous class. Let us continue. What else can Frampton do but beat a hasty retreat? Had he seen a ghost? The niece does have a knack for explaining an uncanny coincidence. Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. So, what did Frampton Nuttall do? He was too scared because he thought that these figures were ghosts, and he could do nothing but run away from the place. And so he picked his stick and hat and headed towards the hall door and the gravel drive and front gate of the house. Now, while he was making a retreat hurriedly, he was not able to see a cyclist who was coming along the road, and he had to run into the hedge to avoid collision. Here we are, my dear, said the bearer of the white mackintosh coming in through the window. Who was that who bawled it out as we came up? So they wanted to know the three figures. Probably Mr. Sappleton wanted to know who was the person who ran away as we entered the house. A most extraordinary man, Mr. Nuttall, said Mrs. Sappleton. He could only talk about his illnesses and dashed off without a word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost. So Mrs. Sappleton explained that this man was Mr. Nuttall, and he is a most extraordinary man. He was only talking about his illnesses, and he even left without saying a goodbye. I expect it was the spaniel, said the niece calmly. So Vera now cooked up another story. Although she had mentioned to Mr. Frampton Nuttall that her Mrs. Sappleton's husband and her two brothers, they had died and they were caught in the bog. But now she cooked up another story, and she said probably Mr. Nuttall was scared of the spaniel dog. He told me he had a horror of dogs. She said that he had informed her that he was scared of dogs. He was once hunted into the cemetery somewhere on the banks of Ganges by a pack of dogs, and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him, enough to make everyone lose their nerve. So she said to Mrs. Sappleton and her husband and the two brothers that probably he ran away because he was scared of dogs, and he was scared seeing the spaniel because once he was chased by a pack of dogs and he had to spend the night in the newly dug grave with all the ghostly creatures, enough for anyone to lose his nerve. The last line of this lesson ends in a clue. Romance at short notice was her speciality. Whose speciality? It was Vera's speciality, and she was expert at it. Just see how she cooked up a story to scare Frampton Nuttall. And then again, she managed the scene so well that she cooked up another story at a short notice, and she befooled Mrs. Sappleton, her husband, and the two brothers. So here the story ends, the open window. You are going to read the story. After watching the video, you are going to write down the important points and post your queries in the WhatsApp group or in your Google Classroom. Thank you. Have a nice day.